Chapter 19. Thursday arrived, and to my general amusement, I still had a pulse and everything. Looks like Nella lost another bet. After a quick shower and general rejection of all questionable breakfast foods in my fridge, I hustled down to help Mama Joe with the morning rush. To my surprise, Mike from the weekend shift was already there, looking a bit frantic and sleep-deprived. "So you've gone and replaced me already, Joe?" I asked with a smirk. She smiled warmly back, genuinely glad to see me, or shocked that her friend Nella was wrong about me being in mortal danger. "Surprised to see me?"
"Not really. Mike here agreed to fill in case you were planning to be out for a while."
Mike waved and said,
"Granted, I'm a shoddy replacement for you, no piano skills to speak of, but I used to play a mean recorder in second grade."
I laughed. "Why didn't you say so? We could have been jamming duets here." Both Joe and Mike continued prepping the morning coffee, and I went around flipping down the chairs in the shop. After I was mostly done, the gangly kid came over holding a cup of coffee.
"Here you go, Finn. Thanks for the help this morning."
I took the cup and saw that the requisite creamer and sugar had already been added. He continued,
"Any trouble last night? No more visits from Manon, I take it."
Mike's sudden interest in my activities the prior night told me he already knew more than he was letting on. I shook my head and sipped the coffee. As he started to turn back to the counter, I asked, "How do you and Anon figure into this? You obviously know each other." Mike smiled and said nothing. He again turned back to the counter and stepped away. "Oh, what the heck?" I said in a louder voice, "Word on the street is that he's an Oryx." Mike stopped dead and looked over his shoulder, smile gone.
"A what?"
he said finally.
"Is that the latest gang out there or something?"
Customers were now piling up behind the register to get their morning motivation, so Mike snuck away, but not before giving away more than he intended. Mike was part of this too. The innocent pimple kid and the skateboard buddies were part of Nella's minions, probably. I had an hour or so to wait to see who showed up to take me to lesson number 2, so I hopped on the piano and started some Beatles for the pimple kid, who was clearly more than he pretended. He gave me a smile and a nod of approval. After a completely normal and unremarkable start to the day, I again started to question Nella's dire warnings about the legions of enemies and their potential impact on me. Sure, the power was real, but the imminent danger that supposedly surrounded every step we took, so far, non-existent. At 9:05, a curious figure caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I turned to see Gladys, chair dancing to Obla-Dee, Obla-Da, and smiling like she was putting on a show, which, of course, she was. I ended the song early, afraid to end up on someone's Twitter feed. "Good to see you, Gladys. If I didn't know any better, I'd say you were trying to upstage me and steal my tips," I joked.
"Honey, my moves would rake in the dough if ever you wanted to put on a show and make some real money."
"Sorry, Gladys, I don't think the circus is hiring." Oh no, she might take that the wrong way. I cringed a little to see how she took it. She must have had a donut on her way here because she just laughed and stood to leave. I waved at Joe and Mike, who were in full hustle mode to keep up with the stream of customers. Gladys's minivan was running when I got to it, keys still in the ignition, doors locked. "Gladys, did you really just lock the keys in the car with the engine running?"
"Really, honey? At some point, you need to start thinking about the power first. Just pop the locks, dummy."
Yep, never dawned on me. I looked through the glass of the door, down at the button controlling the locks, and pushed down with my will. Sure enough, they all popped. I grinned and started to turn around when the alarm horn started blaring. People in the coffee shop immediately looked our way. I looked back at Gladys, and she was full belly laughing, with the car remote in her hand, her thumb still on the red alarm button.
"Oh, you should have seen your face."
She laughed and pushed the alarm button again to silence it. We both hopped in the car, my heart still running a bit fast. My intention for chewing her out for her childish stunt was thwarted by her chubby index finger staring me down.
"That was for the circus," remarked boy.
The smile was still on her face, but she was serious too. All I could do was laugh. "Lesson learned, Gladys. The game is on." We pulled up to the nondescript warehouse, and Zoo was sitting on the curb, legs crossed under him, eyes closed. We drove past him and pulled into the same dark spot, the door closing behind us. I let Gladys open the door for fear of setting off the deadbolts again. Inside, Nella and Daniel were waiting with jackets on, leash in hand.
"Finn, you're coming with us,"
Daniel announced excitedly.
"Just Shadrack's Walk, but it's fun."
I walked over to Nella and nodded good morning. I couldn't resist a barb or two. "Surprised I made it through the night? How much did you lose betting against me?" Nella waved me off.
"Oh, please. I would never bet against you. Not after I called in some favors to make sure that you made it through the night. You may be surprised to hear that I actually want you around for a while. If nothing else, you sure make life interesting."
We made our way back to the minivan with Daniel and the beast in the back. "What's the procedure for our morning romp in the park?"
"Well, the key is," Nella explained, "to never do anything too predictable. We go at different times, to different locations. Sometimes we will hit the park. Sometimes just find a new neighborhood to walk through. The irony is that sometimes the worst neighborhoods are actually far safer for us. Sure, someone might try to mug us, but that's fairly easy to ward off."
We drove for over 20 minutes and ended up at a secluded park that was part of a forest preserve. There were a couple nice cars in the parking lot, so I figured it must be a high-end part of town. Nella drove into the parking lot slowly, scanning the parked cars and the tree line. There didn't appear to be anybody around.
"Ugh, this is fine, Nella," Daniel protested. "Can we get out already?"
"Fine," Nella said with a hint of exasperation. She looked tired of this routine, and I felt the weight she carried on her aging shoulders, protecting this exuberant adolescent.
"You know the routine, Daniel. Stay where I can see you and talk to no one. If I call you, you come, no questions asked." I know. It's been almost a year since they last tried anything, so I really think they've given up on me,"
Daniel said more to me as he and the beast got out of the van. The two of them ran across the field that had a nice picnic area in the center. Trees surrounded all sides of the park, including the single gravel road that led into the lot. Nella continued scanning the tree line like a starving hawk looking for a rabbit. Everything seemed calm and normal. Daniel and his dog ran wildly across the field, taking turns chasing each other. "So this is the dog walking routine. If it's been a year since you were last attacked, why the nerves, Nella?" She took a deep breath and glanced at me before returning her gaze to the trees.
"The fallen are patient. A year is nothing for them to wait. Remember, they are playing the long game. They are not trying to cause a mass restart of everyone. They would prefer to let us all drift ever so slowly away from the core message. There are some estimates that in the next 100 years, the message may be totally lost. I don't believe that, but some scholars do."
"I never thought of it that way. What happened a year ago when they attacked last time?" Nella shook her head slightly.
"I don't really care to relive it, but I will tell you that I learned an important lesson. Never get comfortable."
She was anything but comfortable, walking toward the empty cars in the lot to investigate. I walked with her, mimicking her actions of scanning trees and watching Daniel. Both cars, a Cadillac and a Lexus, were empty. I was struggling to notice anything worthy of alarm. On the side of the parking lot was a large pile of wood chips. They were obviously planning to spread on the trails. It, too, received a thorough inspection. "To be honest, I'm not sure what I'm looking for, Nella," I said. "The sun is shining, the air fresh, clean, the birds singing. In fact, I can't even hear the constant buzz of road noise. This is quite peaceful." Something I said made Nella go rigid, and she took several steps to Daniel.
"What birds?" she said more to herself than me. "Damn it!" She pulled the keys out of her purse and yelled, "Daniel, now!" The kid stopped dead in his tracks and spun in place to look at Nella. He took off at a dead sprint toward us, Shadrack following without being called. The dog kept pace with him even though it was clearly much faster. He was halfway across the field when I saw the flash of a muzzle across the field and heard the crack of a gunshot. I was literally frozen in uselessness. With no clue what was going on, I had no idea how to help.
I didn't know who was doing the shooting or who the target was. Daniel and Shadrach were still running top speed toward us as Nella had both hands extended in front of her, her face solid and serious. Several more shots rang out, followed by the rush of wind, and it dawned on me that Nella was directing the wind to move the bullets. Daniel was now only 10 yards away from us, and he skidded to a stop, looking at something behind us. I spun just in time to catch an uppercut from a big black guy in a leather jacket and earrings. I saw a large boot coming down toward my face, and he let out a yell and flipped backwards onto his back. Shaking my head to get my bearings, I scrambled to my feet and shuffled over to Daniel. Shadrach looked like he had grown even larger as he growled, the hair standing up straight on his back. I looked around and saw several figures with rifles coming across the field, and several more on the near side through the parking lot. We were essentially surrounded. Just then, 2 more cars came down the path, carrying another pack of goons. 6 people gathered around the 2 cars that were blocking the only exit, several carrying shotguns. Nella was grinning wildly, that glint of crazy sparkling in her eyes. Shit just got real. "What do we do?" I pleaded in a whisper with Nella, who had joined Daniel and me. "Connect to a source, and don't give in to fear. Protect that boy." There was no time to ask for clarification as a knife came whipping by my head, missing me by inches. Daniel was looking at me with a grin. Something told me I had him to thank for my intact face. Several gunshots rang out, almost simultaneously, as I heard bullets whiz above my head. About half of them rushed us, and I saw a blur of knives and guns charging us. Daniel thrust his good hand out at them, and they all tripped in unison as a tree root popped out of the ground. Daniel looked at the pile of wood chips, and with the scoop of his arm, the entire pile rose into the air and began spinning in a ball toward the downed fallen. They had very little notice before it started raining wood chips. Several scrambled away, but several more were buried. I could see the pile undulating as the captors fought to climb free. Nella was moving away from us, pulling more than half the attention to the far side of the parking lot. Shots rang out at a regular rhythm, and Nella stopped them all. After a few moments, the buried attackers had climbed free from the rubble and were regrouping. Again they charged, screaming as they ran from the 3 sides. Daniel again extended his hand and pulled back at the air. The pile of wood chips moved under their feet, and they all fell to the ground. It would have been funny if I wasn't in the middle of it. The wood chips were forming a circle around us about 20 feet in diameter. As the fallen hunters got back to their feet, Daniel moved over to the edge of the pile and pressed his hand into the loose wood. It smoked for a couple seconds and then burst into flame, quickly spreading around us. The flames were only a foot high or so at first, until Daniel raised both arms into the air, and wind rushed in from all sides, making the flames leap into a circular wall of fire. So now they couldn't see us, but neither could we see them. With very little warning, a knife-wielding man jumped through the wall and piled into Daniel, knocking him to the ground. Shadrach's attack was instantaneous, and the screams of the hunter were piercing. I pulled Daniel back to his feet and checked to make sure he was all right. Shadrach was not looking to scare the attacker away. Shadrach was out for blood. The attacker had dropped the knife and was frantically kicking and pushing. His calls for help went unanswered from his comrades as Shadrach relentlessly dove teeth first, lunging into his face. Finally, the massive raging dog broke through his now torn and bleeding hands and sunk his teeth deep into the flesh of his throat. A gurgling sound replaced his screams as the massive Shadrach began shaking his head back and forth. The hunter's legs were twitching as the pooling blood grew. I was about to tell Daniel to call off his dog when a series of shots rang out. Daniel yelled, "Down!" and pushed me to the ground with his hand and stump extended over me like a bodyguard. Shadrach returned to our side, red teeth still bared, the fallen hunter motionless on the ground. Bullets continued to ring out from one side. That gave me an idea. "Daniel, they aren't behind us anymore. Kill the fire behind us and we'll make a run for it." "How do you know?" Daniel asked as 2 more shots rang out. He flipped his good hand as the bullets zipped just above our heads. "Because they would be firing blindly at their own guys if they were still surrounding us." Daniel nodded at my reasoning, and the flames on the backside of the circle immediately went out. The 3 of us leapt out of the circle and sprinted across the lot, ducking behind the Cadillac. I chanced to glance back at Nella, who had 2 large trees fall on either side of the group. The trees were slowly sliding toward each other, their branches entangling and trapping several hunters. It was several seconds till our group of attackers realized we were no longer in the circle, and they rushed around it and spread out in a wide line. There were 5 left standing. Personally, I would have buggered out after being attacked by a pile of wood chips that spontaneously burst into flames, and one of my buddies got mauled by a bear. Of course, maybe they weren't that close. One of them yelled out, "Just the boy! We just want the boy alive. We have no intention of restarting anyone today. Keep this up and everybody dies." "Coward! We could do this all day," Nella screamed in his direction. Without warning, a staccato of 2 shots rang out. The first whisked above the car. The second was followed by a thud and a high whelp of a dog. Shadrach had crept out from behind the car looking for his next victim and caught a bullet. He went down in a heap. Daniel screamed and tears poured from his face. Before I could grab him, he dashed out from behind the car and flung himself on his dog. I followed, not knowing what else to do. I grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back to the cover of the car, but he fought me with the unreal strength of an enraged, wiry boy. Looking up, I saw all 5 hunters moving in on us, several with guns pointed. "It's over, boy. Come with us or your friend gets it too," said the same hunter with the snare. I felt the dog, and his chest was still rising and falling. The bullet appeared to have hit him in the shoulder or back. "Daniel, I'll save the dog. You need to save me, okay? Deal?" Daniel's head snapped up and his tear-streaked face was suddenly serious. "Deal." He stood and turned in one motion and pointed his stump at the oncoming posse. His free hand came to rest on my shoulder, and I was alarmed as ice-cold waves pulsated from his fingers. "Don't you let him die," Daniel said to me more as a command or maybe a warning. I put both hands on the dog and felt through the thick black fur till I found the wettest area soaked in blood. When I found the hole, I felt the opening and pressed in on the shoulder bone. The dog yelped and tried to move. It felt like the bullet had hit the shoulder and stopped. Daniel was saying something to the encroaching crowd, but I was focused on the task at hand. Finding my source was easy. His one good hand was freezing my shoulder. Tuning out all the other commotion, I focused on the dog in front of me. Unfortunately, I had no idea how to heal anyone, especially a dog, but my options were not overly plentiful at the moment. If this dog died, Daniel would be ruined. Pull the bullet, heal the bone, seal the wound. I went through the steps that I guessed were required. The world shifted to a shade of blue and seemed to slow down. Daniel's voice sounded like he was in a tunnel. Pull the bullet. I felt the hole in the fur with my finger and focused on the bullet lodged somewhere in the dog. To my surprise, the bullet pulled out easily, making the blood flow freely again. I pressed down on the open wound to slow the bleeding, and it yelped in pain. The broken bone was flexing as I tried to compress the wound. Heal the bone. Pressing on the shoulder with both hands, I felt the bone flex once, and then become more rigid. It was much easier than I imagined. Perhaps it was the fact that I had no choice but to be successful. Now close the wound, I thought to myself. With my slippery, blood-covered fingers, I pinched the open wound closed, and envisioned it sealing throughout the path of the bullet. When I let go, the first aid closed. I did it. With a smile spreading across my face, I looked to see Daniel, now with both arms fully extended, smiling from ear to ear. The blue faded, and his voice returned to normal, and I heard him say, "It's over, you've lost. This is your last chance to leave alive." Slowly rising to my feet, my eyes betrayed my brain about the scene in front of me. There were 4 expensive cars floating 10 feet off the ground. The group of hunters were scattered around, trying to keep from being directly underneath a car that was undoubtedly returning to Earth, probably not in a gentle fashion. Their faces aptly communicated their fear and confusion. Nella didn't look much better. No one seemed to be willing to make a move till a voice up the path shouted a command. "Attack! Kill them all!" Multiple shots rang out simultaneously, and Nella swept her hand wide in front of her to block them. Then Daniel dropped the cars. At least 4 of the hunters were crushed with a thunderous crash. A few others were thrown aside and were lying on the ground. Daniel rushed over to Shadrach, who lay motionless right where I left him. He was breathing, but probably needed blood. The dog wasn't going anywhere on his own. More shots rang out, and I looked to see Nella wiping the air with her hand, sending the bullets away from their intended targets. The click-clack sound of a shotgun reloading pulled me back to Daniel, still cradling his dog, his baby. The hunter was scraped and burned, half his mustache singed, and the burned skin hung loose on the side of his face. He had a sneer, dark and evil, looking down on the blond boy, now with the barrel of a shotgun 6 inches from his skull. My vision snapped back to Blue, and I instinctively pulled the gun from his hand. It slapped into my palms, and the sharp sting snapped me back to the real world. We looked at each other, and then back to the gun. My hands instantly started to shake. I had never fired a gun, let alone killed anyone. Raising the gun to my shoulder, I pointed the shaking barrel at the burned and hideous man in front of me. The weight of Daniel's stare was heavy on me. The hunter's sneer returned, and he stepped closer. "Give me the gun. You know you aren't about to shoot me. You're not the type. You want a killer, you're a piano player." The revelation that he knew me unsettled me further, as if that were possible. He was 2 steps away from pulling the gun from my hands when I felt a hand on my forearm. "Why don't you let me take it from here, Finn?" Nella said. Gently, she took the gun from me, and the hunter immediately withdrew, hands open to his sides. His voice was shaking now. "Now, Nella, you don't want this on your head. The boy's watching after all." The deafening boom of the shotgun echoed through the park as the hunter's head separated from his body in a spray of pink mist and chunks of bone. She turned to her left and saw 2 more hunters trying desperately to reload their guns. She pumped 2 more rounds and they flew back against the smashed cars behind them. The remaining few hunters raced at top speed up the gravel road toward safety. There was another car waiting for them to climb in. As it pulled away, I looked at the taillights and made a very significant connection. My heart sank.